Her knees gave out before she could stop them. One moment Serafina Voss was standing in the center of the great auction hall, her wrists bound in the thin white silk that every unclaimed Omega was required to wear on the night of the grand mating auction. And the next moment, the marble floor was tilting toward her face, and there was absolutely nothing she could do about it. She had been managing the heat, the noise, the press of bodies, and the deep unsteadiness in her legs for over an hour. She had been telling herself, every 5 minutes, that she could manage it for 5 more minutes. She had been wrong, eventually, by exactly 1 minute. The hall was called Drace Hall, and it had been standing for 300 years, and had never once tried to be subtle about it. The ceilings were 40 feet high, and painted in dark gold and deep blue, with enormous iron chandeliers that must have weighed the same as a carriage, hanging above the floor on chains, thick as a grown man's wrist. The floor itself was white marble veined with gray, cold even through the thin ceremony slippers she had been given to wear when her own shoes had been collected at the holding room entrance, along with everything else that had been considered a personal item. They had also taken the small leather bracelet her mother had left her, and she had not objected because objecting would have drawn attention, and drawing attention was the thing she had been most carefully not doing for the past 12 weeks. She was 12 weeks along. She had known since just before the leaves turned color, when she had been sick 3 mornings in a row behind the storage barrels at the back of the pack compound, and a healer named Clara had passed by, and looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has seen this before, and understands exactly what it means, and has decided that saying so plainly is more useful than being delicate. Clara had said nothing aloud. She had left a bundle of dried ginger root outside Serafina's door that evening, with a short written note about proportions and temperature, and the note had also contained, in a small corner, 3 words that said, "Come to me." Serafina had not gone. She had thanked the ginger root silently, and used every piece of it, and tracked down 2 additional bundles from the market stall outside the compound gate, and she had managed on her own, the way she had managed everything on her own, for as long as she could remember. She had kept the pregnancy concealed through a combination of loose, layered clothing, careful posture, deliberate choices about when and where she stood and how, and the particular kind of practiced invisibility that low-ranking Omegas developed over time, because it was the most efficient way to survive a world that was not organized around their comfort. No one looked at her closely. They never had. She was the girl whose mother had died when she was 8, the one who filled the gaps in the compound work schedule without complaint, who took the early morning shifts nobody wanted, and the late-night tasks nobody remembered to assign, and who slipped in and out of rooms without leaving the kind of memory that requires people to account for you. She was easy to look past. In 12 weeks she had made herself easier than ever, and it had worked. The problem was that the child did not seem to share her commitment to being inconspicuous. Over the past 2 weeks, the baby had discovered that it had feet, and it had been using them with the energy and randomness of someone who has recently learned a new skill and is practicing it at all available hours. It had kicked during a quiet meal. It had kicked during the morning briefing in the compound hall. And now it was the 207th lot of the grand mating auction. She had been standing under iron chandeliers in a press of body heat for an hour and 20 minutes, and the child was doing something that could only be described as turning itself around. She had not come here by choice. That was the thing she kept returning to in the 3 days between receiving the documentation and standing in this hall. Edmund, her pack elder, had submitted her name to the regional auction house and presented the signed forms to her on a Thursday afternoon, as though delivering a routine administrative notice. He had explained that her participation was part of a pack debt arrangement, a territorial obligation that required the contribution of a household member. She had asked which territorial obligation. He had looked at a point in the air approximately 2 feet above her left shoulder and said the details were complex and above the level of individual household members to evaluate, and that she should prepare to attend on Saturday. She had understood, in the particular way that people understand things they would rather not, that there was no debt and no territorial obligation. There was Edmund, and an arrangement she was not supposed to know the specifics of, and the fact that her name was already on the submission in ink that had dried. She spent 3 days thinking through her alternatives. She thought carefully, and she thought honestly, which meant she ended up somewhere she did not want to go, which was the conclusion that running with no destination, and no resources, and no plan, 12 weeks pregnant, in the beginning of winter, was not actually an alternative. It was a version of giving up that wore a different coat. So she put on the loose gray dress. She let them take her shoes and her bracelet. She let them wrap the white silk around her wrists and lead her into the holding room with the other 200 women, and she took a position near the back where the air circulated slightly better than it did near the front, and she breathed through her mouth and watched the ceiling. The auction had been going for over an hour when her number was called. The hall smelled like candle wax and expensive wool, and 100 different varieties of wolf beneath the formal clothing, and the combined warmth of so many bodies in a sealed space had become something almost physical by this point, pressing from all sides with a patient, relentless quality that did not intend to let up. The bidders beyond the low-carved railing were arranged in tiers, pack lords in the front rows in their family colors, beta representatives behind them, and in the highest row, a gallery of interested observers who attended the auction the way they attended certain council sessions, not to participate, but to know what had happened. At the front of the room, on a raised mahogany dais set slightly apart from the auctioneer's platform, the man she had noticed when she first walked in was still in exactly the same position he had been in when she arrived. She had noticed him because it was impossible not to. The room arranged itself around him the way a room rearranges itself around a thing that generates its own weight. He was seated on a simple chair on the dais, not the ornate throne it might have been for another sort of ceremony, just a chair that was elevated and still, and he had not moved perceptibly since the auction started. Dark hair, dark eyes, plain black clothing, without a single family marking or decorative element, which was a statement of the most powerful kind, in a room where everyone else had dressed for maximum identification. He had not bid. He had not spoken to the lords who leaned toward him periodically hoping for acknowledgement. He had not checked the progress of the lots or consulted anyone near him. He simply sat, with the complete stillness of a man who was thinking something that had nothing to do with the proceedings in front of him. Seraphina had heard of King Caspian Drace in the way that everyone in all 9 pack territories had heard of him, which was to say that she knew the outline, the youngest king in 3 generations, the man who had sealed his territory gates for an entire year after his mate was killed and governed through sealed decree, without once emerging publicly, the alpha who was considered, by anyone who spoke carefully about him, to be someone you did not cross if you had any choice in the matter. She knew the outline and did not know the man, which was the case for most people who had heard of him. She looked away from the dais and went back to breathing. When the auctioneer called lot 207, Seraphina stepped forward from the group. There was the usual ripple of mild interest from the railing. She was young and considered passable, and 2 lords raised their markers almost immediately. Then the child moved. Not a small adjustment. A full rolling shift, the kind that had become distressingly familiar over the past 2 weeks, where the baby seemed to be reorganizing its entire sense of its own position, and doing so with complete indifference to the circumstances outside. In the quiet of her room at 3 in the morning it was alarming. Here, under iron chandeliers with a hall full of alphas, and the heat pressing in from all sides, and 2 lords already mid-bid, it was too much. The room tilted. A wave of warmth and dizziness arrived simultaneously from different directions, and she had exactly 1 second in which she understood what was happening before she went down. The white silk tore on her wrists as her hands came apart reaching for something that was not there. The silence that came after was absolute. It was not the polite pause of surprise. It was the sudden, complete, total cessation of everything that happens when every alpha in a room catches an impossible piece of information at the identical moment. 2 heartbeats. The first one slowing, cycling into the deep rhythm of unconsciousness. The second smaller, faster, entirely separate, and unmistakably not belonging to the woman on the floor. A second living person. A child, still moving, still strong, announcing itself in a room it had apparently decided it was ready to address. Someone in the upper tier exhaled something that was almost a word, then a voice from further back, female, carrying over the silence with the ease of someone accustomed to being heard. Remove her. An omega who arrives at an auction in that condition is a misrepresentation of the process, and she should not be on the floor. There were small sounds of agreement from several directions. Then the man on the dais rose from his chair. He did it quietly. No announcement, no grand movement, simply the unfolding of a large person from a seated position, and the effect on the room was immediate and total. Conversations that had been starting stopped mid-syllable. Markers went down. Every face turned toward him because when Caspian Drace stood up in a room, the room understood that a decision had been reached and that all further discussion would be academic. He said nothing for a moment. He was looking at Serafina on the marble floor, and his expression gave nothing away, except that he was thinking very specifically about something, and had no intention of sharing it. He spoke to the auctioneer. His voice did not need to be raised to carry. "What is the standing bid?" The auctioneer swallowed, recovered, and named a figure. Caspian named a different figure. The number was so large that a woman in the third row made a sound. The lord nearest the railing, with his marker, already half raised, looked at the amount that had just been offered, and put his marker flat on the shelf in front of him, and did not pick it up again. The auctioneer looked at Caspian, then looked at the room, then looked back at Caspian, in a way that communicated the entire experience of hearing an unprecedented number spoken by a man who clearly meant it, and had no interest in discussion about whether he meant it. Nobody moved to counter. In a hall containing hundreds of wealthy, ambitious, competitive men, not one of them opened his mouth. The gavel came down. The sound of it was definitive. The auctioneer said the required 12 seconds of formal language, and at the end of those 12 seconds, Serafina Voss, still unconscious, still holding the torn silk in her hands, still 12 weeks along, and carrying a secret that had survived 3 months of extraordinary effort, had been purchased by the Alpha King of the 9-Pack territories for a price that would be discussed in the financial records of the auction house for the next 20 years. 2 of the king's household guard crossed the floor with the efficient care of professionals who had been in complicated situations before and had made a decision at some point in their careers not to be surprised by them. They lifted Serafina carefully. They carried her to the east side of the hall where a private door opened onto a stone corridor, and from the corridor to a covered carriageway, where the Drace household vehicles were waiting. Caspian descended from the dais. He did not explain himself to the room. He did not address the woman who had spoken from the upper levels, who was now standing at the railing watching him, with an expression that contained neither pleasure nor surprise, and a great deal of rapid calculation. He did not pause for the lords who were rearranging their faces into supportive expressions, in case supportive was the appropriate response to whatever had just occurred. He walked through the east door. Behind him, in the chair nearest where he had been sitting, a silver-haired man named Aldrich Sorn sat with his hands pressed together at the fingertips and watched the door close. He did not appear surprised. He did not appear relieved. He appeared, if anything, like a man who has been watching a long and complicated operation reach exactly the sequence he had planned for, and is now in the particular position of being correct about something that he was not entirely certain being correct about was worth the cost. He had been waiting for this for 3 years. Outside in the cold carriageway, Serafina's hands were open in her lap, the torn silk draped loosely across her palms. Her breathing was steady and even, the breathing of someone who has simply stopped for a moment, rather than someone in distress. The child inside her, apparently satisfied with everything that had been accomplished this evening, had gone entirely still. She did not know yet what she had been carried into. She had no way to know what the palace behind the Drace crest held for her, or what the blood signature in her child's heartbeat meant to the man who had emptied an auction room with a single number, or what any of it meant for the months ahead. She did not know the history that was waiting to be told to her, or the enemies who were already adjusting their plans in response to what had just happened in a hall she was being carried away from. The child kept its steady, quiet, private heartbeat, as though it had always known exactly where it was headed, and had simply been waiting for the rest of the world to stop arguing about it and catch up. The ceiling was the first thing she saw when she came back to herself. It was the kind of ceiling that a person did not forget quickly, which is a strange thing to notice in the first moments of regaining consciousness, but Serafina Voss had always had the habit of taking in her surroundings before she took in anything else, because surroundings were more reliably honest than the people in them. The ceiling was high and arched, painted in shades of deep blue and layered gold, with patterns that swept from corner to corner in long, deliberate strokes that must have taken someone months to complete, and must have required scaffolding she could barely imagine. It was beautiful in the particular way of things that were never built with any thought to the practicalities of the people who would live under them. She lay still for a moment, and let the ceiling settle into place. Then she remembered where the ceiling was attached to. She sat up too fast, which was a mistake. A wave of dizziness swept through her, and she pressed both hands flat on the mattress and held herself upright and breathed carefully until it passed. When it had passed enough, she took stock. The room was enormous. It was the largest room she had ever been inside, that was not a public hall or a compound assembly space. The furniture was old and fine, and arranged with the ease of things that had always been exactly where they were, and saw no reason to change. A fireplace on the far wall held a fire that was already burning steadily, which meant someone had lit it while she was unconscious, which meant someone had been in the room while she slept, which was something she filed away as needing more thought. A tall window with curtains pulled partially back let in the pale gray light of early morning. There was a wardrobe against the wall that was considerably more expensive than any building she had personally lived in. There was a table near the window with a covered tray on it that smelled, even from the bed, like real soup and bread made from actual ingredients. There was a chair in the corner near the fireplace. In the chair sat King Caspian Drace. He was not asleep. He was not reading. He was not doing anything at all except sitting with one arm resting along the chair's arm, and watching her with the absolute stillness of a man who had been watching for some time, and had decided that patience was the correct policy, and was not going to abandon it simply because she had woken up. Serafina looked at him. He looked back at her. The fire made its sounds and the morning light held where it was, and neither of them said anything for approximately 4 seconds, which was longer than it sounds. "Where am I?" she said. Her voice came out steadier than she had expected. She appreciated this. "The east wing of Drace Palace," he said. "You've been here a few hours. You collapsed at the auction, approximately 3 hours ago, and were brought here directly. How long before that was I in the holding room?" "I don't know the holding room schedule," he said. "Longer than the auction itself," she said. She looked around the room again, not because she had missed anything, but because she needed another second. "What do you want with me?" He was quiet for a brief moment. "You are safe here," he said. You did not answer the question. A pause that communicated, without any visible expression, that he had noticed this observation, and had decided to continue anyway. "There are things that need to be understood before I can answer it with the accuracy it deserves." "That is also not an answer," she said. Something moved through his face very briefly. Something that might in a different person have been a small reaction of acknowledgement, and then it was gone. He stood from the chair, and standing he was taller than she had properly registered at the auction hall, which had been an impression of large and dark and still rather than specific measurements. He crossed to the door, and paused with his hand resting on the frame. "Eat," he said, looking at the tray on the table. "The healer will come within the hour to check on you. Nothing will be done to you in this room. That I can promise you without any conditions attached to it." "And outside the room?" she said. He looked at her for one beat longer than the question seemed to require. Then he left. The door did not make any sound closing. She went to the door immediately. The handle turned freely, and the door opened without resistance, onto a corridor, where 2 guards stood at attention, in the dark household colors of the Drace estate. Neither of them moved or spoke or acknowledged her in any way. But their presence, positioned exactly where they were, at exactly the distance they were maintaining, communicated with the complete clarity of things that did not need words, that the door being unlocked was a courtesy extended by someone who wanted it, understood as a courtesy, and that it was not the same thing as an invitation. She went back inside. She sat down at the table and lifted the cover off the tray. The soup was thick and well seasoned and still warm, which meant it had been brought recently, which meant someone had been tracking her state of consciousness and timing the food accordingly, which she filed away with the other things. There was fresh bread beside the soup, dense and slightly sweet, the kind made with effort rather than convenience. There was a cup of something herbal and mild, and precisely the right temperature for drinking immediately, and a small dish of fruit that had been cut and arranged with a care for presentation that seemed, in the current circumstances, almost touching in how much it missed the point of what would actually help her. She ate all of it. She was not embarrassed about this. The baby had been running a continuous negotiation with her sense of hunger for weeks, and the negotiation had recently shifted further in the baby's direction, and arguing with the terms had not historically done anyone any good. When she had finished, she sat with both hands flat on the table and thought about her situation, with the directness she had always found more useful than the alternative. A young woman arrived after approximately 30 minutes. She introduced herself as Ada, assigned to these rooms, carrying an armload of folded clothing she said had been gathered while better options were being arranged. She had the particular manner of someone who was genuinely friendly by nature, and had been given a professional briefing about the situation, and was doing her honest best to hold both things without dropping either. She made the bed with the efficiency of someone who had been making beds for years and had removed all the unnecessary motion from it, and she asked if there was anything specific Serafina needed, and did not flinch at all when Serafina said ginger root, simply nodded and noted it, and said she would have it sent up immediately. There was something in Ada's manner that was quietly, practically comforting. She did not look at Serafina's midsection with curiosity or calculation. She did not ask questions she was not supposed to ask. She offered information carefully, when it seemed useful, and withheld it carefully when it did not, which was a more sophisticated skill than it appeared. By the time she left, the bed was made, the tray was cleared, the new clothing was folded on the chair, and Serafina had a reasonable initial map of the room's geography, and the rough shape of what was available to her. The ginger root arrived within 20 minutes, along with a small handwritten instruction sheet about steeping temperatures and proportions that was specific enough to be useful, rather than generic enough to be decorative. Someone had gone to the effort of finding out how to do this properly, rather than simply sending ginger in the direction of a pregnant woman, and assuming that was enough. She noted this. Clara came that afternoon. Serafina had not expected this. Clara was the healer from the compound, 2 days' travel from here, and her arrival suggested either that she had been summoned specifically, or that she had been in the vicinity already, for reasons that had not yet been explained. She examined Serafina with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who trusted her own assessment more than any amount of verbal reassurance, checked the baby's position and heartbeat and her own temperature and pulse with quiet competence, and at the end said in the measured tone of professional understatement that everything was as it should be, and that Serafina needed more rest and more food, and needed to stop treating the stress she was clearly under as something that was not affecting her physically, because it was, and Clara could see it. "I know," Serafina said. "Knowing and doing something about it are not the same," Clara said. She said it without particular criticism, the way a person says something true that they have said before and will say again as needed. Then she packed her bag and said she would return tomorrow, and left in the same efficient quiet in which she had arrived. That evening, Caspian came back. He knocked. She had not expected him to knock. It was such a small thing, in a situation full of large ones, but she noticed it because it was the kind of detail that told her something real about how he was managing this situation, which was information she needed. She said, "Come in," and he opened the door and stood in the frame without entering the room. "Are you comfortable?" he said. "I am in a room that is larger than any I have occupied before," she said. "I am not uncomfortable. Comfortable seems like the wrong word for the current arrangement." She looked at him. What happened to the 2 lords who had raised their markers? "They went home," he said. "And the woman who spoke from the upper tier?" A brief pause. Something in his expression closed slightly, not with secrecy, but with the specific caution of someone who is managing several things at once, and has decided what to address in what order. "She is a different concern for a different conversation," he said. Serafina had been sitting, and now she stood, because she had learned a long time ago that conversations where she was sitting, and the other person was standing, or in a doorway, always went in one direction, and she was not interested in that direction. She crossed the room until she was a reasonable distance from him, and looked at him directly. "You paid more for me at a public auction than some pack territories cost," she said. "I am carrying a child whose father I am not going to discuss in this room tonight. You purchased me and brought me here, and you have offered me exactly one piece of information, which was that I am safe, and while I have decided provisionally that this might be true, I need something more than one piece of information to work with. I would like you to tell me what you intend." He was quiet for longer than a simple answer would require. "The child's heartbeat," he said at last. "When you fell, you know the room went silent." "I was not conscious for that part," she said. "Every alpha in that room heard it," he said. 2 heartbeats, the second one much smaller, much faster, but clear, and carrying something in its signature that nobody expected to hear. He paused. "A royal marker, specifically, one that matches my line." The room was very still. She heard the fire. She heard the baby shift in its quiet rolling way, the movement she had begun to identify with something almost like greeting. She heard her own breathing, which was slower than she might have expected given what she had just been told. "That is not possible," she said. Her voice was entirely steady, because the full understanding of what he had said had not yet completed its arrival, and she was holding herself in the space between hearing the words and knowing what they meant. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had spent the past several hours sitting in a chair in a room, watching someone sleep, and thinking very precisely about this conversation, and had still not found a way to make it easier. "I know," he said quietly. "I know it is." He said he needed to speak to someone. He said she would have the full information she was owed, and she would have it soon. He said she should try to sleep again if she could. He said these things with the measured economy of someone managing their own response to an unmanageable situation, one small action at a time. He left. Serafina stood in the center of the enormous room in the firelight, and thought about the fact that she was carrying, apparently, something considerably more complicated than she had understood, in a palace she had arrived at unconscious, purchased by a man who had just told her that her child's heartbeat carried his bloodline signature, and had not yet explained how he thought that was possible. She pressed her hand to her middle, the baby pressed back, which was its habit when she was still and quiet long enough for it to notice. She stood with the fire behind her, and the gray dawn starting beyond the window, and she said quietly, just to the two of them, "I am going to find out what all of this is. And I am going to understand it, and then I am going to make some decisions." The baby did not visibly respond to this, but it settled, which she took as reasonable agreement. Downstairs, in a study whose walls were lined with territorial maps going back 2 centuries, King Caspian Drace stood at a long table and looked at the silver-haired man, who had arrived precisely when sent for, and had sat down without being asked to, which was itself a statement about how long he had been in this household and what their relationship had become. He said 4 words in a voice that was not raised and did not need to be. "Tell me everything. Now." Aldrich Sorn had served 3 kings across 4 decades. He had survived every transition, every crisis, and every shift in political direction through a combination of genuine competence, exact timing, and the fundamental understanding that information was only as valuable as the moment in which it was deployed. He had held secrets through years, when holding them had cost him sleep, and through years when it had cost him friendships, and he had weighed those costs against what he knew about the alternative, and chosen silence each time with a care that he was fully prepared to defend. Even here, even now, with the man across the table looking at him the way Caspian Drace looked at things when he was holding a considerable amount of force in reserve. He began with Alara, because that was where the roots were. He said her name with the care of someone who understood it was not a neutral word in this room and never would be, and he watched the king's face as he said it. What he saw was not the acute grief of 3 years ago, the raw, close to the surface weight that had been visible even through the king's characteristic control in those first months. What he saw now was something quieter and denser, the grief of a man who had integrated it because there was no other choice, and integration was the only version of survival available. The grief was still there. It had simply found its permanent address. Ilara had been curious about family history, not in the political sense, not as a power calculation, but in the personal way that people get curious about the edges of their own genealogy when they have time and access, and a question they have been turning over quietly. She had found a record in the archive that was not restricted but was not prominently filed, in a section that would not have been easy to locate without knowing exactly what you were looking for. The record documented the former king's first bond, dissolved and removed from the formal succession record before Alara's father made his second alliance, and noted in that record the existence of a daughter from that first bond who had been formally separated from the line at the age of 14 and resettled in the border territories. The daughter's name was Nora. Ilara had been systematic. She had traced Nora to the specific border territory where she had been sent, located the pack records from that region, and found that Nora had lived there quietly for many years, had had a child of her own, and had died while that child was very young. The child had been raised by the surrounding pack under the pack's household name rather than her mother's, which was standard practice in resettlement situations, and also a highly effective way to ensure that a bloodline connection to a royal line went unnoticed. The child's name was Serafina Voss. Aldrich paused here, giving the king time to absorb the structure of what was being built, before he added the weight. Ilara had understood what she had found. She was intelligent, and she was careful, and she knew the court well enough to know that the blood right register, the oldest succession document in the kingdom, did not distinguish between direct and indirect descendants when the blood signature matched. If Nora's child carried a sufficient royal marker, and Alara had reason to believe she did, because the marker tended to pass with surprising fidelity through the female line, then under blood right law, that child was a legitimate documented heir of the royal bloodline, not the primary heir, not a head of a direct bond heir, but a recognized protected descendant with standing. Alara had begun making arrangements to petition for the documentation to be formally recorded. She had moved quickly, because she was not naive about what the information meant to the people in the court who had benefited from the bloodline appearing to be limited to a single line. She had moved quietly, because she understood that the formal documentation could not be challenged once it was recorded, but could very easily be disrupted before it was. She had not told Caspian, because she wanted to be completely certain before she brought it to him, and because she had hoped to hand him something finished and verified, rather than something in progress. She had been intercepted on the road 3 days before reaching Serafina's territory. The silence in the map room was very complete. Aldrich named 3 individuals. 2 of them were no longer living, or no longer in any position of relevance, having exited the political landscape through death and disgrace respectively in the years since. The 3rd name he set down carefully, the way a person sets down something fragile in a room where other fragile things are already arranged. Varon Ashcroft. Caspian said nothing. His stillness was the particular stillness of something that has been struck and has not yet moved, not because it will not move, but because it is deciding where to move to. Aldrich continued. Varon had not been the architect of the broader conspiracy. The architects were the 2 former figures, and the interests they had represented, the ones who had wanted the bloodline narrowed for territorial and financial reasons that predated Alara's discovery by a decade. Varon's involvement was more specific. She wanted proximity to the crown. She wanted the kind of influence that came with being the primary figure around an unmated king, who had no close bond and no heir, and was therefore, in the logic of the court, in a state of perpetual vacancy that someone would eventually fill. A living documented heir, particularly one born in legally ambiguous circumstances, undermined that position in multiple ways and threatened to complicate it indefinitely. She had been part of the decision to act before Alara reached her destination. After Alara's death, the territory had returned to what the faction considered normal: no mate, no direct heir, the border territory child hidden under a pack name, and a court that was cautiously waiting for the king to emerge from his year of solitude and begin accepting the political landscape as it was. Varon had positioned herself carefully and patiently for 2 years after that. Then the Autumn Harvest Festival had happened. The king had attended alone, without notice, without identifying himself to anyone, the way a man attends an event when he needs one night of being no one in particular. He had not expected to speak to anyone. He had not planned to. The woman he had encountered at the river's edge had not known who he was, because there was nothing in his appearance that night to indicate it, and because she had not been looking for a king when she sat down beside a stranger who looked like someone she recognized in the specific way of people who are carrying the same weight. The child that resulted from that night was not merely Caspian's heir by that encounter. It was the convergence of both royal lines simultaneously, his own, through the direct paternal line, and Nora's, through Alara's half-sister's maternal line, meeting in a single child for the first time in the history of the blood right record. Under ancient pack law, this child was not simply a recognized heir. It was the most comprehensively documented heir the kingdom had ever produced, with a blood signature so strong that it had announced itself to an auction hall full of alphas without any assistance and before the child had even been born. Aldrich finished. He folded his hands on the table and waited with the patience of a man who understood exactly how much he had just delivered and was giving the person across from him the appropriate amount of time to receive it. Caspian said nothing for longer than Aldrich had prepared for. When he finally spoke, his voice was precise and very quiet. "You knew this 2 years ago." "Yes," Aldrich said. "You knew where she was. You knew who she was. You knew what her blood signature would mean under the register." "Yes." "And you waited 2 years." "Yes." "Explain to me," Caspian said, in the tone of someone who is going to listen to the explanation and then evaluate it, "why you should still be in this room after telling me that." Aldrich explained. He explained it with the completeness of a man who had been preparing this explanation for 2 years, and understood that this moment was the one it had been prepared for. The faction had people watching the border territories, watching for exactly the movement that Caspian would have made if he had been given the information, going to find her, pulling her into protection, making her visible as someone the king had specifically sought out. Visible was the wrong thing to be. Visible was what had gotten Ilara killed. The auction, with its public setting and its 1,000 witnesses and its lords from every pack in the 9 territories, was the one context in which the child's existence could be announced publicly, before anyone with the means and the motive to act against it could do so without that action being observed by a room full of people who would then ask inconvenient questions. The auction had been the protection. I did not anticipate the fainting, Aldrich added. I should note that openly. That element was not in my planning. Caspian turned away from the table. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room, one hand on the sill, looking at the palace grounds in the dark. A single lamp burned on the path below. 2 guards made their rotation in the distance, moving in and out of the lamplight with the regularity of a clock. Somewhere in the palace's east wing, in a room he had sat in until he was certain she was breathing normally and steadily, a young woman was processing information that was going to reshape everything she had understood about her own life. Edmund, Caspian said. He knew enough, Aldrich said. Not the complete picture, but sufficient to act. He was paid. By the Ashcroft estate. I believe so. I need 1 more day to trace the final link in the financial record. But yes, the motive is Varen's, and the means were in place before the auction was scheduled. She paid him to submit her name, Caspian said. She paid him to submit the name at this specific point in the pregnancy, before the legal situation could be stabilized in any way, so that when the Lex Puritas was invoked, it would apply to the maximum possible disadvantage. Aldrich paused. The plan assumed the child would be born without any formal bond record or blood right documentation. The Lex Puritas would then make the heir legally invisible, and Serafina would be... Would be what? Caspian said, still facing the window. Managed, Aldrich said precisely, in whatever manner was most convenient. Another long silence. Leave, Caspian said. Aldrich rose from the table and went to the door. He paused with his hand on it, because there was one more thing, and it needed to be said even though this was not the ideal moment for it. The blood signature in the child is as strong as it is, he said, because the convergence works in both directions. Serafina herself carries a secondary royal marker from Nora's line. She has always had it. She has simply never been told. He paused. You should know that the child you have been considering as your heir is, under the blood right register, the most fully documented royal descendant in the kingdom's history. Both lines, full strength, neither halved. He paused once more. I thought you should understand the scale of what exists upstairs. Caspian did not turn from the window. Aldrich left. The door closed. The map room held only the sound of the fire in its grate and the weight of everything that had just been laid out across the length of a table, and the king stood at the window for a very long time, looking at the grounds below and thinking about a year spent ruling through sealed decree, and a night at a border festival, and a marble floor in a hall full of lords, and a child whose heartbeat had announced itself to every alpha in the room, without asking anyone's permission first, and what all of it meant put together. Outside in the east wing, a lamp burned low near a wardrobe. Serafina Voss was awake, one hand pressed to her middle, listening to the palace, and thinking through everything she had been told, and everything she had not been told, and the precise size and shape of the space between those two things. She was very good at the space between things. She had been living in it for 3 months and managing it alone, and she had not been defeated by it yet. She did not intend to start now. It came to her in pieces, the way most of the important things had always come to her, not arriving all at once but assembling themselves over time from individual parts that did not seem significant until there were enough of them in the same place. The first piece was the voice. She was lying awake on the second night, the room lit only by the low burn of the fire's last hour, listening to the baby do its midnight adjustments, and thinking about the things she had been told, and the larger number of things she had not yet been told, when something Caspian had said during their brief evening conversation came back to her. Not the specific words, but the rhythm of them, the particular weight and placement that was more characteristic than any single word could be. She had heard that rhythm somewhere before. She had heard it sitting at the edge of a river in autumn, while rain gathered on the far horizon, and neither of them had been ready to leave yet, and she had found it then the most restful thing about the entire night, because it had been the voice of a person who was not performing anything. She lay very still with this. The second piece was a gesture. Ada had brought her dinner that evening, and had set out the food with the quiet competence of her normal routine, and at one point, she had described the king's schedule in general terms while making conversation, and she had mentioned, almost without emphasis, that when he stood in doorways, he always had the same posture, which the household staff had taken notice of over the years, because it was so consistent. The weight back on the rear foot, the hand on the frame, the particular stillness of a man who was practiced at existing at thresholds. Serafina had filed it at the time. Now, lying awake, she retrieved it and held it alongside the voice. The third piece was his hands. She asked Ada in the morning, keeping her voice at exactly the level of casual inquiry, whether there was a portrait of the king somewhere in the palace. Not the formal state portrait, she said, the one that was reproduced in every administrative hall in the 9 territories. Something older, something from before the crown. Ada considered and said yes. There was one in the long gallery on the 2nd floor, part of a series that had been commissioned for the palace archive, when the king and his younger siblings were young. She offered to take Serafina there, and Serafina said yes. The long gallery was a corridor of pale stone, with high windows on one side, and paintings hung at measured intervals on the other. They walked past landscapes and formal portraits, and what appeared to be someone's extremely detailed record of territorial flora, until Ada stopped in front of a painting near the east end of the corridor, and stood quietly to one side. The young man in the portrait was perhaps 18 or 19. He was seated rather than standing, and he was looking slightly past the painter rather than at the painter, which gave the image an unguarded quality that the artist had either worked very hard to achieve, or had simply been given by luck, because the subject had not been paying attention. The hair was shorter and darker than what she saw now. The face was younger, the bones still settling toward the version they were becoming. But the hands resting on the arm of the chair were exactly as she remembered them from the riverbank in autumn, in the moment when he had turned toward her unexpectedly, and she had seen them in the firelight from the festival lamps across the water. And the eyes, looking through the moment at something considerably further away, were exactly right. Serafina stood in front of the portrait for a long time, long enough that Ada said, very quietly, "Are you all right?" "Yes," Serafina said, which was approximately accurate. She went back to her room. She sat in the chair by the window and put the pieces together with the precision she had always brought to things she needed to understand completely before she acted on them. He had been at the autumn festival on the border territories approximately 8 months ago, alone, unannounced, without anything on his person or in his appearance that identified him as anything other than a traveler passing through. He had been there because he needed a single night of being no one, which she understood completely, because she had been there for the same reason. He had sat at the river's edge for a long time before she joined him. He had talked with her for most of the night with the honesty that is available only when no one knows who you are. He had been grieving. She had been grieving. They had both been people who needed somewhere to put the weight for a few hours, and they had ended up at the same river at the same time. And now she was in his palace, carrying a child whose heartbeat carried his royal signature, and neither of them had expected any part of what their night at the river had become. She sat with all of this for an hour. Then she asked the guard at her door to pass a message to the king. She said she would like to speak with him, and that it was not an emergency, but it was not avoidable either. He came within the hour. He knocked. She called for him to come in. He opened the door and stood in the frame in exactly the way Ada had described, the weight on the back foot, the hand resting on the carved wood, and she knew beyond any remaining uncertainty that she had been right. She looked at him and said, "You were at the autumn festival on the border between the Voss and Caro territories. Approximately 8 months ago, near the end of the harvest season, before the first real cold. You were there without announcing yourself, and without anything on you that said who you were, and you sat at the river's edge for a long time, and then you spoke with someone for most of the night, and in the morning you left." He was very still. She continued, "You never gave a name." "Neither did you," he said. His voice was quiet and entirely steady. "I know," she said. "I was there because my mother had died the week before. and I needed to be somewhere that was not the room where she had been. I went to the festival because I needed the noise. I did not plan to speak to anyone. Neither did I, he said. The fire made a small sound. Somewhere distant in the palace, a clock struck, and the sound of it faded without urgency. You were grieving, she said. It was not a question. She had known it the night of the festival, had read it in him, the way you read it in people when you are carrying the same weight yourself, from the particular slope of the shoulders, and the way the eyes look at distance rather than near things. Yes, he said. Your mate, she said. He looked at her steadily. Her name was Alara, he said. She died almost 3 years ago. His voice held the particular quality of a sentence that has been said many times in many contexts, and has never once in any of those times become ordinary, which is its own kind of weight. I'm sorry, she said simply, because she meant it, without any complication or qualification. I'm sorry about your mother, he said, with the same plainness. They held that for a moment. Two people who had gone to the same festival for the same reason, and had spent a night being honest with each other in the specific freedom of anonymity, and who had afterward carried the memory of it in entirely different directions. She as a secret, and a fear, and a small private warmth she had not known what to do with, and he as something he had apparently carried without knowing it was his to carry. After that night, she said carefully, did you know anything? Did you look for me? He shook his head. I knew nothing about you. Not your name, not your pack, not your family. You told me nothing identifying, and I did not ask, because that was the agreement of the night. I returned to the palace the next morning, and returned to everything I had been doing before. He paused. I was not looking. I did not know there was anything to look for. She believed him. This was important to understand, because it meant that whatever had been arranged around her, by Edmund, by Varen, by people who had apparently known more about her situation than she had, none of it had been engineered by the man currently standing in her doorframe. He had been at a festival. He had talked to a stranger. He had gone home. The blood signature, she said. In the hall. You heard it and you knew. Immediately, he said. The pattern is specific. You would know your own family's pattern, the way you know a name. And before that night, she said, had anything in the pack records, or the archive, or anywhere given you any indication that there might be someone like me, a connection to your bloodline through an indirect line? No, nothing. He met her eyes directly. I want to be certain you understand that this is not a situation I was managing. I did not know who you were. I did not know what you were carrying in the bloodline sense. I knew none of this until the hall. She looked at him for a moment. I believe you, she said. Something in his face shifted very slightly. Not surprise exactly, but a small recalibration, as if he had prepared for the possibility that she might not, and was now adjusting. There is a great deal you still need to tell me, she said, about the Lex Puritas, about the council session that is apparently coming, about what the lords in this palace are going to decide about my child, about what all of it means for the two of us, and for the child specifically. She held his gaze. I want real explanations, not management. I can form my own conclusions if I have accurate information. I know, he said. You will have it. A knock at the door. Aldrich, who entered with the manner of someone who was not apologizing for the timing, because the timing was not something he considered negotiable, and said that the council chamber was assembled, and had been for some time, and that the lords were beginning to make comments about the quality of the seating arrangements, which was their way of saying they were impatient. Caspian looked at Serafina. She gave him a nod that said clearly, this conversation is not finished. I expect it to continue, and I am willing to wait a reasonable amount of time but not an indefinite one. He left with Aldrich. She turned to the window, where the gray winter afternoon was going grayer, and she thought about a riverbank in autumn, and a man who had looked, from a certain angle, in a certain light, like someone who was standing at the edge of something he had not yet decided about. She had sat down beside him not to help him, or rescue him, or do anything, except be another person in a difficult night, with somewhere to be. She had not expected that night to follow her here. She put her hand to her middle and felt the baby, which was doing something deliberate and repetitive that she had come to understand as a form of communication, though about what she had not yet worked out. She thought, I sat down beside you because I recognized you, and she thought, I still do. The council chamber in Drace Palace was a room that had been designed to make everyone sitting in it aware of the weight of what had been decided in it before them. The table was long and dark and had been polished by so many years of use that it reflected the faces of the people sitting around it like dark, still water. The chairs were carved and high-backed, each one bearing the crest of one of the 9 pack territories, and when all 9 were occupied by the people they were designated for, the visual effect communicated something about the structure of the kingdom that no written description could have matched. The windows were narrow and positioned high in the walls, admitting light in precise vertical lines that moved across the stone floor throughout the day at the pace of a slow clock. The room said, "Decisions made here outlast the people who make them," and it said it continuously and in every direction. Caspian took the head of the table and let the room settle into its proper quiet before he spoke. They were all present, all 9 lords, plus advisors, plus Aldrich at Caspian's right, with his leather satchel, and the particular patience of a man holding something he knows will be useful at exactly the right moment. Lady Varen Ashcroft sat 3 places from the king's left, dressed in winter black, that contrasted with the elaborate family jewelry several other lords were wearing, which was either a statement about her relationship to ornament, or a statement about something else entirely. Lord Conrad of the Eastern Territories sat directly beside her with the ease of a man who had already made his decision about which side of this conversation he was on, and found the decision comfortable. 7 other lords arranged themselves in the remaining positions, in various attitudes of calculation, genuine curiosity, or carefully maintained neutrality. "You've all traveled quickly," Caspian said. "Thank you for the response." "We came," Varen said, and her tone was the tone of someone correcting an implied narrative without raising her voice to do it. "Because what occurred in this territory's auction hall last night is a matter that concerns every alliance and every succession arrangement in all 9 packs. This is not a private matter." "Which is precisely why all 9 seats were invited," Caspian said pleasantly. Varen looked at the table surface for 1 second, and then looked at him. "An unclaimed Omega was purchased at the Grand Mating Auction by the reigning king. The purchase is within the legal structure of the auction. What follows from it is not a simple matter." She opened the portfolio she had placed on the table when she arrived, and removed a document that was old enough that the ink had gone brown, and the paper had softened at the edges from handling. She placed it flat on the table in front of her, so that the lords nearest her could read it, without needing to lean significantly. The child that was heard in the auction hall carried a blood signature, specifically, a royal blood signature. The Lex Puritas is explicit on this point. A child born outside a formally consecrated and registered bond carries no claim to the royal line, regardless of what the blood signature contains. This is established precedent, and it is not subject to individual modification. Lord Conrad nodded from his position beside her. 2 lords in the middle of the table shifted slightly in postures that said they were reserving judgment, but listening carefully. The others remained where they were. Lord Garrett of the Northern Territories was a broad man who ran a demanding stretch of land and had the unhurried manner of someone who had sat through enough councils to have learned that patience was a more effective tool than urgency in almost every circumstance. He looked at the document without picking it up. "The Lex Puritas was drafted in the 2nd century, he said. The political problem it was created to address was territorial lords, using informal bonds, with low-ranking partners to engineer heirs, specifically to destabilize succession arrangements that the drafters wanted to protect. That was the specific crisis it was written to solve." "Historical context does not override the text," Varen said. "Historical context tells us what the text was for," Garrett said, "which is relevant when you apply it to situations the original drafters could not have anticipated." "Text is text," Varen said. "Interpretation is politics. Text without context is also politics," Garrett said, with a mildness that suggested he had made this argument before in various rooms and was not going to stop making it. "Let Aldrich present," said Lord Philip from the far end of the table. He was a practical man, with a practical man's habit of identifying the relevant thing and pointing at it. He had noticed that Aldrich had a satchel he had not opened, and in his experience, that was always the relevant thing in any council meeting that contained Aldrich. Aldrich opened the satchel. He produced 3 items and set them on the table in sequence. The first was the blood right register, bound in deep blue leather, its spine repaired in 2 places, listing every confirmed royal descendant with their recorded blood signature markers across 2.5 centuries of documentation. The second was a medical record, sealed with the palace healer's mark, prepared that morning, recording the blood signature observed in Serafina's child, and noting its correspondence to the register entries on 6 of 7 primary markers. The third document Aldrich placed without introduction, setting it on the table and allowing those who needed to read it to do so at their own pace. Lord Conrad leaned forward first. He read. Something moved behind his eyes. The document was a record of lineage tracing Serafina's mother, Nora, to the blood of the Queen's elder half-sister, a connection formally removed from the official royal record, more than 4 decades ago, and assumed by everyone aware of its existence to be permanently concluded. "Where did this come from?" Varen said, looking at the lineage document. "My personal archive," Aldrich said. "I have held it for 2 years." 2 years, she repeated. 2 years, he confirmed, with a pleasantness that was one of his most effective tools. Varen looked at Caspian. Her expression was controlled, and her voice was controlled, and she was an extremely disciplined political operator. But something in the quality of her stillness had changed in the way that things change when a plan encounters an element that was not anticipated. "The Lex Puritas still stands," she said. "A blood right claim through an indirect descent line has never been directly tested against the Lex Puritas in formal council precedent. The two have never collided." "Then this council will establish the precedent," Lord Garrett said, and his tone now contained something that might have been genuine intellectual interest at the prospect of a novel legal question. "This is precisely what this body exists for." What followed was 2 hours that moved in the way that formal council deliberations move. Circles at first, the same ground covered from different angles, and then triangles, as the angles of argument became clearer to everyone in the room, and then a gradual slow approach to an axis, around which everything was organizing itself. The axis was this: both the Lex Puritas and the Blood Right Register were legitimate pack law, with standing in the kingdom's legal history. They had simply never collided directly. The resolution of the collision would require formal deliberation and a formal vote. The vote would not happen today. Something else became clear during those 2 hours, in the way things become clear in council sessions without being said directly by any particular person. Varen had arrived prepared to invoke the Lex Puritas. She had the document. She had Conrad's support arranged in advance. She had anticipated the counter-argument and had prepared responses to several versions of it. This was the behavior of someone who had been keeping the statute available for a specific planned moment, not the behavior of someone who had consulted the law in response to an unexpected event. Several lords around the table reached this observation independently, and then quietly noted the presence of the lineage document that Aldrich had held for 2 years, and made the connection that the lineage document's existence had presumably been known to more than one person in this room, and that certain things had been arranged in response to it, and that this was a different category of situation than a straightforward legal dispute about succession. Nobody stated any of this plainly. It would be stated plainly later, when the evidence was assembled. For now, it sat in the room like furniture that everyone can see, but no one has been formally introduced to. After the lords had gone to their allocated guest quarters, Caspian returned to the east wing. Serafina was at the table with the last of her evening ginger steep cooling in front of her, and the expression of someone who had spent the afternoon thinking through a problem from several directions, and was not finished, but was willing to pause for new information. He sat down across from her, which was something he had not done in any of their previous conversations, all of which had involved him in a doorway or at the far end of a space. He sat across from her at the table where she was sitting, and she noticed this. He told her what had happened. He was direct and detailed, and did not soften any part of it. He told her about the Lex Puritas and what it said, and how Varen had invoked it. He told her about the Blood Right Register and Aldrich's counter-documentation. He told her about the stalemate and the vote that would be coming. She listened to all of it without interrupting. "The council votes on whether my child has rights," she said when he had finished. "They believe they do," he said. "What do you believe?" He was quiet for a moment. "I believe the Blood Right Register predates the Lex Puritas by 100 years, and is more fundamental to the legal structure of this kingdom than any statute written after it. I believe that a child born with the strongest convergence of royal blood signature in the documented history of the register cannot be made legally invisible by a statute written to address a completely unrelated problem in a different century." He paused. "I also believe that what I believe and what I can force through unilaterally are two different things, and that forcing it produces fractures that my son would spend his life managing. She looked at him steadily. Could you force it? I have a royal decree mechanism, he said. Yes. Why haven't you? Because a decree that bypasses the council creates exactly the fractures I described. I want the lords to vote correctly, because they have been persuaded it is correct. That decision is durable in a way that a forced decree is not. She was quiet for a moment. That is either very principled, she said, or very slow. Something crossed his face that was the closest thing to a wry smile she had yet seen on him. Possibly both, he said. Don't let the second quality win, she said. He looked at her. The fire in the room was burning well. The winter evening outside was dark and cold, and entirely indifferent to the proceedings in the palace. He said, I won't. And in the way of things that are communicated more clearly, without formal agreement, than with it, something in the room settled slightly, and two people sat across a table from each other, and understood, without saying so, that they were looking in the same direction. The meeting where everything was finally and completely told happened in the East Wing itself. Serafina had stated this as a condition the previous evening, clearly and without room for misunderstanding. If there was a truth that concerned her life, the whole truth, not the managed portions, she had been receiving one room at a time. She wanted to be present for its delivery, not told afterward, not given a summary. She wanted to sit at the table and hear it in real time, and have the right to ask questions during it, rather than being handed conclusions after they had already been reached by other people. Caspian had agreed without argument. This was becoming a pattern she was beginning to understand. He was capable, apparently, of hearing what she needed, and then providing it, without requiring a negotiation first. She was still deciding what to make of this, because she had so little experience of being given what she asked for, without a negotiation, that she was still checking it for conditions. Aldrich arrived the following morning with his satchel, and his careful face, and the posture of a man who is relieved to be doing the thing he should have done sooner, whatever the cost of doing it now. He sat across from both of them at the table by the window, with the winter grounds visible below, and the pale light doing nothing to make anything feel easier, which was appropriate. He began with Alara, because the roots of everything ran through her, and because there was no honest way to start anywhere else. He said her name the way you say a name that has weight in the room, and he watched Caspian's face when he said it. What he saw there was the settled form of something that had once been very raw and was now carried rather than fought, the kind of pain that has found its permanent place in a person and stays there without requiring much active management. He noted it and continued. Ilara had been curious about her family's history. This was not political curiosity, not a power calculation, but the personal kind of interest that surfaces in people who have been told one version of their family and sense the edges of a version they have not been told. She had spent several evenings in the archive, looking through sections that were not restricted, but were not prominently organized, and she had found a record of her father's first bond, dissolved and removed from the formal record before his second alliance, noting the existence of a daughter from that first bond. The daughter's name was Nora. At the age of 14, she had been formally separated from the succession and resettled in the border territories, with sufficient resources to live comfortably, and the clear understanding that the topic of her existence was not one that would be publicly raised. Ilara had traced Nora. She had gone through the regional pack records for the border territories where Nora had been sent, found the documentation of Nora's years there, and found the record of a child born to Nora and registered in the pack under the pack's household name. The child had been raised by the surrounding community, without any particular knowledge of her mother's actual lineage, because nobody who had the knowledge had been inclined to share it with her. The child was Serafina. Ilara had understood what this meant. She was intelligent, and she had spent years in close proximity to pack law and succession structure, and she knew that the blood right register did not make distinctions based on the formality of the relationship through which the blood was carried. If the marker passed, it passed. And she had reason to believe it had passed fully, because her father's first bond partner had been as highly marked as anyone in the record, which meant that Nora had carried the marker, which meant the child she had had in the border territories had an extremely high probability of carrying it too. Ilara had begun making arrangements. She had moved quickly and quietly, telling no one at court because she was not naive about what she had found, and what it would mean to certain people if they discovered she was pursuing it. She had intended to tell Caspian when she had the formal documentation in hand, when it was a completed and recorded fact rather than a finding in progress. She had been on the road to the border territory when she was intercepted. The silence at the table was very complete. Outside the window, the grounds went about their ordinary morning below. A gardener was clearing the path near the east hedge. 2 palace cats crossed the far corner of the garden and disappeared behind a wall. Everything outside was entirely indifferent to what was being said inside. Aldrich named the people responsible. He named them in order of their involvement, giving the most recent name last, because it was the name that would require the most from the 2 people sitting across from him, Baron Ashcroft, not the architect of the original decision, which had been made by interests older and broader than hers, but a participant in what had been done to Ilara on that road, because Varen had a specific interest in a specific outcome, which was to be the most significant presence around an unmated king, who had no heir and no close bond. A surviving documented heir, particularly one born in legally ambiguous circumstances, complicated that position in ways that Varen had decided were unacceptable. Caspian said nothing when Varen's name was said. His stillness changed quality, the way a material changes quality when force is applied to it, becoming denser rather than softer. He did not look away from Aldrich. He did not move. Serafina looked at Aldrich steadily. She was part of what happened to Ilara, she said. A participant, Aldrich said carefully. Not the primary figure. The primary figures had broader interests. Her role was specific to the outcome she personally needed. And my mother's line, Serafina said. Nora's removal from the succession predates Varen's involvement, Aldrich said. That was your grandfather's decision, in his own political moment. Varen's involvement came later, when Ilara's discovery threatened to reverse everything that had been arranged. He opened the satchel and produced the financial document. Edmund, your pack elder, submitted your name to the auction house after receiving this transfer. He placed the document on the table. The transfer traces to a holding account, connected to the Ashcroft estate. He was paid to submit you at a specific point in the pregnancy, before any formal documentation could be prepared, while your bond status and your lineage were both legally uncertain. He paused. The plan, he said, was that the child would be born without any formal bond record. The Lex Puritas would be invoked, the heir would be legally invisible, and Serafina would be— He stopped briefly, and the stopping itself was informative. Would be what? She said. Removed, Aldrich said, from the situation, in whatever manner was most convenient and least visible. The room held the weight of this for a moment. Serafina looked at the financial document on the table. She had known something like this since the first night in the palace, known it in the way you know things you would rather not know when you have no choice but to think clearly. But there is a difference between the abstract knowledge of something and the specific, documented version of it laid out in front of you, and she let the difference be what it was, without trying to flatten it into something more manageable. She arranged the death of your mate, she said, looking at Caspian. She paid my pack elder to sell me at the moment when I was most vulnerable. She planned to have my child declared legally invisible, and then have me removed from the picture so that she could continue being the most significant person around you. She said it all plainly, because plain language was the only language she had ever found genuinely useful for things that were large and terrible. She did this because she wanted access to a position near the crown that a living heir would have made impossible to hold. Caspian did not respond immediately. He was looking at the table surface in a way that communicated the specific experience of receiving information that reframes 3 years of history and requires the entire history to be understood differently. He was absorbing it, and he was doing it without asking to be protected from it. And Edmund, Serafina said, turning back to Aldrich. Did he know the full picture? He knew enough, Aldrich said. He did not know the details of what happened 3 years ago, but he knew who you were connected to, or he suspected it strongly enough to act on it, and he went to the Ashcroft estate with what he knew, and came back with instructions and a payment. She pressed her lips together. He found out I was pregnant, she said. He worked out who the father probably was, and he sold that information, and then sold me. Yes, Aldrich said. She put both hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment. Then she looked at Caspian. He was looking back at her now, and his face had the quality it had when he was letting what he was feeling be visible, rather than managed, which was rarer and more significant than it might seem from the outside. "There is one more thing," Aldrich said. He had been building to this, and his voice reflected the particular care of a person saying the last thing that needs to be said, when everything that preceded it has already been very large. "The child's blood signature is as strong as it is because the convergence runs in both directions. You yourself carry a secondary royal marker inherited from Nora through your mother's line. You have always carried it. You simply were never told." He paused. "Under the blood right register, you are the highest surviving documented descendant of the maternal royal line currently living. The child carries both lines simultaneously, at full strength, in a single person, for the first time in the kingdom's documented history." Serafina stared at him. "That is why the heartbeat was unmistakable," Aldrich said. "It was not one blood signature but two, meeting and compounding. Neither halved, neither indirect." He met her eyes. "I thought you should have the complete picture." He rose from the table, said he would make himself available for further questions when they were ready, and left. Caspian and Serafina looked at each other across the table. She said, after a moment, "I don't know who I am anymore." He crossed the table. He did not go to the window or the door frame. He sat down across from her, and he said, looking at her directly, "You are the same person who managed 3 months of this alone. You are the same person who stood in the middle of that hall and kept quiet, and kept her head, and kept going right up until the moment her body made the decision for her. That does not change because of what bloodline runs through it." She looked at him. The winter light came through the window and fell between them on the table. "You should be angrier at Aldrich than you are," she said. "I am," he said. "I am choosing the order in which I address things." She almost smiled. It was the first time she had almost smiled since arriving in this palace, and it lasted only a second, but it was real. "All right," she said. The baby pressed against her ribs, its familiar insistent signal that it was present and had opinions. She put her hand to her middle. For the first time since she had arrived in the palace, since before the auction, since before any of this, she felt something that was not certainty, and was not safety, but was something in the direction of both. Edmund arrived on a Thursday, 4 days after the council session, via the side entrance to the palace. The side entrance was used for deliveries, and for administrative arrivals of minor significance, which told her something about how it had been chosen, or told her something about Owen, who was the kind of person who made choices without explaining them, and who was generally right. Owen was the captain of the palace guard, a broad-shouldered man of few words who communicated primarily through the angle of his jaw and the precise economy of his movements, and who had the air of someone who had spent a long career deciding that the work was the point, and the commentary on the work was not. He escorted Edmund through the side entrance with 2 additional guards and brought him to a formal receiving room on the ground floor. The room was smaller than the council chamber and in some ways more precise because of it. The ceiling was high enough to be significant. The table was long enough for the required distance. The chairs were solid and upright. It was a room that said, "Everything said here is on record," without saying it in any register that could be contested. Serafina was already at the table when they arrived. She was sitting in the chair at the head, which was Caspian's chair in any formal context where he occupied it. He had offered it to her without ceremony, and she had accepted it without ceremony, and that was the entire transaction. Caspian stood against the far wall. He had positioned himself there when they arrived, and had not sat down, and had not introduced himself to Edmund and was not planning to, which Edmund appeared to have understood immediately, because the moment he entered the room his eyes went first to Serafina, and then moved very briefly to the tall, dark figure against the wall, and then came back to Serafina and stayed there, because the alternative involved maintaining eye contact with someone who was making the air in the room heavier, simply by being in it. Edmund looked smaller than she remembered him. He had always been large in the compound, large voice, large authority, large sense of his own significance, in a territory that rewarded the performance of significance. He had occupied the pack meeting hall the way people occupy spaces they have decided belong to them, and he had communicated his ownership of situations through the particular fullness of his presence in them. Here, in a palace receiving room with a high ceiling and 2 guards at the door and the king against the far wall, Edmund looked like something that had been reduced to its actual scale, and the actual scale was considerably more ordinary than the scale he had been running at for most of his life. "Sit down," Serafina said. He sat. She did not offer any preliminary, any softening, any version of the conversation that gave him a gradual approach to the thing they were actually discussing. She asked him directly why he had submitted her name to the auction house. He used the version about pack obligations. She told him she knew that was not accurate. He shifted to a version involving external pressures and decisions made above the level he could control. She said she knew about the financial transfer from the holding account connected to the Ashcroft estate. The color left his face in a way that was not gradual. She gave him time. He talked for a long while, using more words than the truth required, which was the way people used words when they were trying to arrange the truth into a shape that was easier to be responsible for. He talked about pressures and timing, and the sense that she had not truly belonged to the compound in any meaningful way, and would have left eventually anyway, and that what he had done was not so different in its essential nature from the arrangements pack elders made regularly in the course of managing territorial obligations. He said all of this with the particular effort of someone who is constructing an argument they do not entirely believe, while the person they are making it to sits across the table and watches them build it. She let him finish. Then she said, "You knew about the child." Edmund looked at the table. "You knew, or you suspected strongly enough to act on it," she said. "You found out about the pregnancy, and you worked out who the father likely was, or you had help working it out, and you took that information somewhere, and traded it for the arrangement that sent me to the auction." He said nothing. "You went to Lady Varen Ashcroft," she said. "She paid you for what you knew, and told you what she needed done, and when she needed it done, and you followed the instructions." Edmund raised his eyes to her face, for the first time since sitting down. He had the expression of a man who had expected one kind of confrontation, and was receiving a different kind, one that did not have the anger and desperation in it that he had been bracing for, and therefore had none of the handles he had prepared to manage it with. He looked at her and said, very quietly, "Yes." "And after the child was born," she said, "what was the plan for me?" He did not answer. She waited. Owen made a small sound from near the door, a shift of weight, a minimal adjustment, the kind of sound that has no content except presence. "You don't need to tell me," Serafina said. "I already know. I am saying it in this room so that you understand I know it, and so that you cannot leave this room having told yourself that the part after the birth was something that was going to happen to someone else, something you were not part of, something that you were not responsible for, because someone else was going to carry it out." Her voice was steady and even, and she was looking at him with the direct, unornamented attention of someone who has already moved past needing anything from this person, and is here for a different purpose entirely. "I want you to understand the full shape of what you chose to do, not for an apology. I am not asking for an apology. I am asking for your understanding, which is different, because understanding is something you carry, and an apology is something you give, and then put down." Edmund sat in the chair and looked at her for a long time. He was a man who had operated his whole career on the assumption that the people below him in the pack structure had a limited capacity to do him any meaningful harm. He had managed Serafina on this basis for years. She was quiet, she was compliant, she was easy. She would absorb whatever was done without excessive complication. He had sold her on this basis. He was sitting now in the chair across from the person he had sold, and she was none of those things in this room. She was something else entirely, and the thing she was entirely was neither angry nor forgiving, but simply fully clear about what had been done, and that clarity was more difficult to be in the presence of than either of the alternatives would have been. She had said what she came to say. She did not wait for him to speak again. She looked at Owen, and Owen stepped forward, and Edmund was escorted out of the room and into the custody that had been arranged for him. When the door closed, the room held only herself and Caspian, and the fire and the winter light. She sat in his chair at the head of the table and looked at her own hands for a moment. "Are you all right?" he said, from across the room. "I am furious," she said, "not at you, at the whole structure of what was built around me without my knowledge, by people who assumed I was too small and too invisible to matter, except as a means to some other end." She paused. "And I am furious at this palace, at the fact that since I arrived, this child has been discussed in every language, except the language of what it actually is. It has been a blood signature, a legal claim, an heir under dispute, a political inconvenience, a succession question. In all the hours of all the conversations in all the rooms of this palace, The child has been everything except a person who is going to be born, and who will need things that are not legal recognition. She looked at him. I am the only person in this building who has been thinking about this child as a child, and not as a case. He said nothing. He listened. I want that acknowledged, she said. Acknowledged, he said. She looked at him. That is your entire response. What would you like me to say? He said, and he was genuinely asking, not deflecting or managing. She thought about it for a real moment. Tell me what you would give this child, she said. Not what the kingdom needs from it, what you, as the other parent of this particular person, would want it to have from you personally. He was quiet for what felt like a considered silence, rather than a stalling one. Then he said, time. The kind of time that nobody gave to either of us. Time to understand who it is, before anyone explains to it who it is supposed to be. She looked at him. He looked back. That is a good answer, she said. That afternoon, Caspian removed the remaining restrictions on her movement within the palace. He arranged this through Owen without making a performance of the arrangement, which was how she preferred things to be done. Owen was assigned to accompany her walks, not as a restrictive guard, but as someone who knew the palace's geography precisely, and was very good at silence. He turned out to be excellent at silence, and surprisingly informative when she asked him direct questions, which she did regularly, because direct questions to Owen produced direct answers without additional material she had not asked for. She walked every afternoon. The corridors first, then the ground floor rooms, then, when the weather permitted, the formal gardens. The winter gardens were stripped and cold and honest about their own state, in the way she found more restful than concealment. The paths were clear stone, pale and cold underfoot. The sky was gray in the layered, deep way of winter sky over open ground. The trees stood bare along the path with the particular dignity of things that have decided their own presence is sufficient. On the fourth evening of walking, coming around the long stone hedge at the center of the garden, she found Caspian on the path. He was not looking at anything particular. He turned when he heard her approach. I did not know you came here, she said. I don't usually, he said. Ilara liked this section of the garden, the bare trees in winter. She said they were the most honest thing in the formal grounds. She understood then what had brought him here, and she did not question it. She fell into step beside him, because it seemed like the natural thing to do, and they walked the path together in a silence that was not uncomfortable. After a while, without any particular preamble, he talked about Ilara, not the bloodline, not the succession, not the legal and political circumstances of her life and death. He talked about who she was. He said she had been someone who noticed things that other people walked past without registering. The way certain light in the afternoon changed the color of stone walls. The precise difference between two ways of saying the same thing. The sound rain made on the long gallery windows when the storm came from the east rather than the north. He said she had laughed easily at things she found genuinely funny, and not at things she found only mildly amusing, which was a distinction that made the genuine laugh worth more. He said she had thought slowly, and formed opinions carefully, and kept them until they were solid enough to offer, which meant her opinions were worth something when she did offer them. Serafina walked beside him and listened. She thought about what it sounded like to hear a person talk about someone who had loved them and been loved by them, in the specific register that came from losing that love rather than from having it currently. She thought about the riverbank and the way he had been sitting at its edge that night and what he had been sitting there with. She did not say any of this. She said, "She sounds like someone who would have found all of this very interesting." He looked at her. "She would have," he said, and his voice contained something she had not heard in it, in formal contexts. Something that was loss, and also something warmer. The warmth of remembering a person accurately, rather than in the flattened way that grief often remembers people. They walked to the end of the path and turned back. The palace lights were warm in the east wing windows against the dark garden. Neither of them pointed out that this was the longest time since she had arrived, that neither of them had been managing something urgent. Some things survive only as long as they are not named. The night of the attack was the coldest of the month. Serafina had been awake for most of the hour before it happened, which was not unusual. The baby had developed a strong and consistent preference for the period around midnight, during which it apparently had a great deal to accomplish, and was not inclined to accomplish it quietly. She had been lying in the dark, cycling through positions that might satisfy both of them simultaneously, which was increasingly a theoretical project rather than a practical one. and listening to the palace settle around her with the particular sounds of an old building that has been managing its own weight for a very long time, and is confident about it. She heard the first sound at midnight. It was small. A footstep in a place where no footstep should be, coming from the section of corridor that turned left, toward the servant passage. The servant passage was used during the first guard rotation, which had finished over an hour ago. The second rotation had completed 20 minutes after that. The corridor beyond her door at this hour should have been completely empty. She sat up and did not call out, and did not move toward the door. She sat very still in the dark, and listened with the careful attention of someone who has learned that listening carefully before acting is always the right decision. The second sound came from the same direction, heavier than the first. Then a door opening at the far end of the corridor. Then a voice, low and brief, and she recognized the particular quality of it even at that volume and through a closed door, in the way you recognize certain things from their shape before you can see them clearly. Then approximately 12 seconds of silence, which is a long time when you are sitting still in the dark counting it. Then sounds that resolved quickly and without ceremony. The door to her room opened. Caspian came in. He was not dressed formally. Plain dark clothing, nothing that indicated he had been in his official rooms when this started. His left arm was elevated slightly from his side, and in the low light of the lamp Ada had left burning near the wardrobe, she could see that his sleeve was wet and dark from somewhere below the elbow. His eyes found her immediately. "Are you all right?" The question came before anything else. "Yes," she said. She was already off the bed. "Are you?" "It is not significant," he said. She crossed the room to the lamp and brought it close, and looked at his arm without accepting his assessment of it. The cut was long and clean, running from midway up the forearm toward the wrist, the kind made by something sharp in the brief moment before it was deflected. It was bleeding more than it was dangerous, which was a specific type of injury that looked worse than it was, but it needed to be addressed properly, and it needed to be addressed now. She put her hand on his shoulder and pushed him toward the chair with enough firmness that he sat. She pressed the towel from the washstand flat against the wound and told him to keep still. "It is not serious," he said again. "It will be less serious if you stop moving," she said. "So please stop moving." He stopped moving. She held pressure and looked at him. He was looking back at her from the chair, with an expression that was not the king's expression, and was not the careful, controlled expression he generally wore in formal interactions with her. It was something underneath both of those, something that had been pressed closer to the surface by the last 15 minutes, and it was more open than anything she had yet seen on his face. "How many came?" she said. "3, he said. 2 are with the outer guard. 1 left through the service entrance on the other side of the building before the corridor could be closed. Owen has it? He is managing the outer yard. The corridor will be sealed in the next few minutes." She kept pressure on the wound, and thought about 3 men in the servant corridor at midnight, and about the guard rotation that had been altered, because she had spent enough time in this palace now to understand that an alteration to the guard schedule required access and authorization, and that the number of people with both was not large. She thought about who had the motivation to use that access, and what they expected to accomplish, and whether they had expected to accomplish it tonight, or on a different night that happened to be tonight. "Varen sent them," she said. "In all likelihood," he said. "Can you prove it?" "Not yet," he said, "but the man who got out will be found, and when he is found he will be interviewed, and at that point we will have what we need." She looked at him steadily. "You were in the corridor," she said, "before any of this started. You were already there." He held her gaze. "Yes." "You were not in your own rooms," she said. "No." She absorbed this. "Have you been in the corridor before tonight?" He was quiet for one moment. Not evasive, not uncomfortable, simply giving the question the correct weight before answering it. "I have been in the adjacent suite for the past 4 evenings," he said. She looked at him. He looked back, and his expression said everything his voice was not going to say, that he had not announced this, had not asked for permission or acknowledgement, had not made it into anything that required her to respond to it. He had simply placed himself where he could be useful, which was the most honest kind of doing something that existed. 4 evenings, she said. "Yes," he said. Clara arrived 25 minutes later, which meant Owen, or one of the other senior guard, had sent for her the moment the situation was understood, which meant there were people in this building who were paying attention to the right things at the right time. Clara examined the arm with the brisk professionalism of someone who has seen worse, and said so only when it was useful information. She cleaned and dressed the wound and said a number of specific things about not using the arm unnecessarily, which Caspian received with the expression of a man filing information in the area of his mind he intended to visit at some point after he was done with everything currently requiring his attention. Clara left without ceremony. Ada had appeared at some point during this process, had set up additional lamps and a tray of tea, and had then made herself absent with the quiet skill she applied to everything, correctly reading the room as something that needed fewer people in it rather than more. The palace outside was settling into the particular silence of a secure situation after a disturbance. Footsteps in the corridor, brief and organized. A door closing at the far end. The guards doing their work with the competence of people who had been trained for exactly this, and were finding it manageable. Inside the room, Caspian was in the chair by the fire, and Serafina was in the chair by the window, and neither of them suggested that he should go back to the adjacent suite. The thought existed, but nobody said it, and since nobody said it, it remained a thought rather than becoming an agenda item. They talked for the rest of the night. Not about what had just happened, not about the council or the Lex Puritas, or the vote that was pending, not about the evidence they would need to gather, or the confrontation with Varen that was coming. These were the topics that the day had been full of, and the day had not yet officially ended, and they could be set down for a few hours without the world unraveling. They talked the way they had talked at a riverbank in autumn, without positions to defend, without the particular formality of people who are also managing a legal situation, and a political crisis, and a palace full of lords with competing interests. They talked with the specific honesty that becomes available when everything has become too significant to pretend, when the carefully maintained distances have been compressed by circumstance into something that no longer makes sense to maintain. He told her what he had been thinking when she sat down beside him at the festival. He said that he had been startled when she appeared, and then, almost immediately, grateful, because she had not arranged her behavior around who he was, or what she thought he needed from someone who had just sat down beside him. She had simply been there, in her own state, with her own grief, and that had been the most unexpectedly restful thing he had experienced in the better part of a year. She told him about that night from her side, the grief about her mother that had no clean shape to it, the way a loss that size fills every available space and makes it difficult to simply be somewhere without the loss being the most present thing in the room. How she had gone to the festival not because she wanted to celebrate anything, but because she needed the sound of other people being alive around her, and how sitting at the river's edge with a stranger who was also quiet in a specific, weighted way, had felt, in some strange manner, like being less alone in the middle of an experience that was fundamentally about being alone. He said he had thought about that night more than he was comfortable admitting to himself in the months afterward. He had not told this to anyone before. She said she had done the same. It was the first time she had said this plainly, even to herself. The fire burned itself down to a low, steady pulse. Neither of them moved to add wood. The room went slightly cooler, and neither of them minded, because the conversation was doing something more necessary than the fire, and interrupting it for the fire seemed like the wrong trade. At some point well before dawn, she said quietly, "What happens if the vote goes wrong?" "It will not," he said. "But what if it does?" she said. He looked at her, and his voice, when he answered, had moved past the careful measured quality it usually carried, into something more direct and more final. "Then I will use the decree," he said. "I told you I wanted the council to reach the right decision by their own logic, and I still want that. That kind of decision is more durable than one I require of them. But if they vote wrongly..." He stopped briefly, then finished the sentence in a different register than he usually used. "I will not allow the vote to set the terms under which my son comes into the world. I should have said this without qualifications from the beginning." "Yes," she said. "You should have." He looked at the window, where the dark was beginning to be the kind of dark that has a future in it, rather than the kind that simply continues. "I am also learning," he said, with the particular dry understatement of someone who means it completely, and is not being modest. Something came out of her that was a small laugh. It surprised both of them. It lasted only a moment, and then it was over, but it was real. and in the room where it happened, it felt like something that had been closed for a while, opening briefly. By the time the gray of pre-dawn arrived at the window, Caspian was asleep in the chair, his bandaged arm resting along the chair's side, his head slightly back, breathing with the steady evenness of someone who had been awake for a very long time and had found, finally, a moment that was safe enough to let go in. Serafina was awake in her chair, watching the ceiling change as the light shifted in it, incremental and patient, from the deep blue of 3 in the morning toward the grayer blue of something that was not yet dawn, but had decided to try. The baby was entirely still, which had not happened at this hour in several weeks, as though it had been listening to everything and had decided at last that the situation was under competent management.